Hello everybody and welcome back to a brand new video where today we're going to be taking a look at the pros and cons of bookshelf speakers versus floor standing speakers. More specifically, we are joined today by the Bowers and Wilkins 704S3 and the 705S3, taking a look at the two comparatively and like I say a broader look at bookshelf versus floor standers as well. Before we get stuck into the meat and bones of this one, thank you again for your support on the recent uploads. Again, if you could leave a big thumbs up on this one, would be much appreciated, as well as your thoughts, good, bad or ugly, in the comment section down below. And yeah, the first thing we're going to touch upon is the design of the bookshelf versus the floor stander. Again, the Bowers and Wilkins 704S3 and the 705S3. Let's get going. So the first thing to bear in mind when you're comparing your purchase is going to be the price. Now, if we're looking at the B&W here, as we are today, the 704 versus the 705, if you include the stands with the bookshelf speaker, they're actually very similarly priced. The floor stander is going to cost you roughly around £100 more. This is on the basis that you include the B&W stand here, not like a third-party stand or anything like that. So price-wise, very comparable. Footprint size also quite comparable as well. I mean, I think for a lot of people, when you're choosing between a floor stander and a bookshelf, the size of the footprint of it and how much room it's going to take up is obviously something you're going to be bearing in mind, but it's actually not as big of a factor as you might imagine here. The 704, the floor stander, is actually the slimmest and most low profile floor standing speaker that B&W produce, and yeah, that shouldn't really be a decisive factor between these two, although generally speaking, obviously a bookshelf speaker is going to take up a much smaller amount of space compared to the floor stander, just not in this particular case. When it comes to the studio sound that B&W have tried to go for here, I actually think it's quite comparable to the KEF sound. Now, we listened to the R3 Metas a few weeks ago, we did a video on those, so if you did want to see that, I'll leave a link to that in the description down below. But yeah, it's not a bad thing, both sound fantastic, they're both very dynamic, detailed, accurate speakers, and I think one thing we covered that was a big selling point for the KEF was how easy they were to place with some of the technology that's built into the speaker, and that's exactly what B&W have aimed to do here. Again, they're trying to get that balance between making something that's really home friendly whilst also giving you that studio accuracy. On the face of it, when you compare the floor stander and the bookshelf, there's obviously a lot of differences that jump out straight away. The big one obviously being the tweeter on the top of the bookshelf. Quite a unique design choice that Bowers and Wilkins have gone with there. The carbon tweeter that's mounted onto the top is actually one that's taken from the Diamond 800 series, so the level above, and now it's been brought down to the 700, which is a really cool addition. There are two extra drivers on the floor stander compared to the bookshelf. Always going to be the case. One thing that's always going to be the case when you're looking at a floor stander is because you've got a larger cabinet pushing out more air, you're naturally going to find it handles the lower end side of things a little bit better, as well as normally offering a bit more separation as well with the different drivers as well. So that's something to bear in mind when we go into into a bit more depth on the sound comparison between the two. But yeah, both designed really cool, and like I say, I particularly like the unique design of the bookshelf with the tweeter on top as well. Quite unique, quite cool. So when we listened to both the floor stander and the bookshelf, we put them in the same system just to make sure that the comparison was as fair and everything was as much the same as possible. We used the Yamaha RN2000A network receiver, which is something that puts out 100 watts per channel. The bookshelf, the 705, operates between 30 and 120 watts, whereas the floor stander, as you might expect, asks for a little bit more power. That operates between 30 to 150, but with the Yamaha putting out 100 watts, very good level for both these speakers to be getting the most out of both of them, and worked really well, to be fair. I must say, Yamaha, we spoke about it in the past, a brand I'm really a big fan of. Really powerful, really well built, and yeah, no exceptions here. So touching upon the 705S3 out of the two first, the bookshelf, the first thing that jumped out to me was the low end on it, which is actually far better than I expected it to be. As mentioned, this could be an area of big disparity between a floor standing speaker and a bookshelf, but I actually found that the bookshelf here handled it really well. With the carbon tweeter on top, it kind of provided a really sharp, detailed sound. With what the 700 series is aiming to do, which is kind of provide that studio kind of sound in a home system, that was really evident. It's, like I said, very detailed, very precise, very accurate. The tweeter can make it a little bit harsh, which can potentially be fatiguing over long listening times, but again, I've said this before, I think this very much depends how you listen to your system. If you're someone that's kind of just laid back, listening to the music, I don't find that can be too much of an issue. But if you're someone that's really sat there listening to the equipment, trying to pick out the finer details in the system, that's when the fatiguing can become a bit more prevalent. So it is there, don't get me wrong, but I still think the sound on the whole was a really well balanced one, and again, super accurate and super detailed here. When we're looking at the floor standing compared to the bookshelf speaker, it was actually very similar in terms of sound signature. Again, B&W have gone for this kind of detailed studio kind of sound, and both speakers do definitely capture that really well. But as you'd expect, there are a couple of differences. The major one being the two aerofoil bass drivers that are built into the floor stander, which provide not only a bit more separation for the sound because of them being not just the bass drivers here, but having more drivers is going to provide a bit more separation. But those twin aerofoil drivers mean there is just a lot more low end, generally speaking. Now, I found that the low end on the bookshelf was quite a tight, precise low end. Perhaps that's not as much of the case on the floor stander, but there is definitely more of it. I mean, again, because of that separation, because of it being a bigger unit, because of there being more drivers, it's just a much larger sound. And again, that's something that you'd expect from a lot of floor stander versus bookshelf comparisons, and that's no different here. Larger sound, more separation, more low end. Some people might say that's not necessarily the best thing. Some people might prefer the tighter low end, but yeah, very comparable speakers nevertheless. Another thing that you could potentially touch upon is if you are someone that does want a bit more low end and you did want to add a subwoofer into the mix, obviously that's something you can do on both systems. Again, I wouldn't say that's not necessary at all with a floor stander, but with a bookshelf, potentially that's something that you could look to do. And if you were to add a subwoofer into the equation, that does give you a little bit more flexibility to try and fine tune that low end, something that obviously you're not necessarily going to have with a floor standing speaker. So if you did want to add that low end to the system, you could do, and again, you're going to get a bit more flexibility, so that's worth bearing in mind as well. I think another thing that's worth bearing in mind as well is how you're going to be using these speakers. I think if you're someone that's just listening to music, then maybe that's somewhere where you could lean a bit more towards the bookshelf speaker. But if you're someone that's going to be using these in an AV setting, then that again, I think, is somewhere where the floor stander is going to shine a lot more, because you've got that bigger sound, you've got those extra bass drivers. So that's worth bearing in mind as well. I think, again, for that much bigger sound, perhaps, you know, stereotypically you think of watching an action film or something like that, the floor standers are going to shine a lot more than the bookshelf in that kind of scenario because of those twin aerofoil drivers. Another couple of things that are also worth bearing in mind are the biggest factor really when looking at a bookshelf versus a floor stander is your room, the room that the speakers are going into. A bookshelf is always going to be better in a smaller room. A floor stander is always going to be better in a larger room, 9 times out of 10. Obviously, the bigger cabinet, more air being pushed out, creating a bigger sound. You don't want that in a smaller room. It's just not going to be right. It's going to be overwhelming. It's not going to sound great. Whereas a bookshelf's going to be much better, much more refined. It's just going to be a much better fit in general. And it's also worth bearing in mind, again, that if you are cranking up the volume, if you're someone that's listening to these speakers on a real high volume level, a floor stander is always going to handle that a lot better as well. I mean, distortion isn't something that's ever going to be a major factor when you're looking at a speaker to the level of the 704, but the 705, forgive me, the bookshelf. But it is something worth bearing in mind if you're looking at other bookshelf versus floor standards, that a bigger cabinet is always going to handle a higher volume a lot better, and the more drivers you've got as well is going to make that more manageable. So yeah, higher volumes, floor standards are always going to be better for. But that being said, the 704 did handle that side of things really well. I think, to summarise, the biggest factor when you're deciding between a bookshelf and a floor stander is it's really going to come down to your setting and where the speakers are going. I think 9 times out of 10, if you're looking at a bookshelf speaker, it's going to be a smaller space. A floor standing speaker is going to fill up a larger space a lot easier. That's a bit of a no-brainer really. But both of these speakers were fantastic. I mean, as I mentioned at the start, the 700 series is a range that's designed to kind of bring that studio level of detail and accuracy and make it really easy to house essentially, and they do that really well. Big pros of the bookshelf, obviously smaller footprint, more flexibility if you're wanting to add a subwoofer in there as well, so there's that to bear in mind. But again, if you're looking to fill a bigger room, a larger space, you can't really go wrong with a floor standing speaker. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. I mean, are you someone that leans towards a bookshelf or a floor stander? Do you lean either way, or does it vary from speaker to speaker? I mean, again, I always find that bigger for a bigger room, smaller for a smaller room tends to be the general rule of thumb. So I'd love to know if you agree with that in the comment section down below and your experiences. And again, if you did enjoy this video, make sure to leave a thumbs up on it. Make sure to leave the feedback down below. And yeah, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you on the next week's video. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.